Hello, everyone, and today we're going to start the second I guess this would be the second installment of the series on divorce and remarriage. This time we're focusing on the Latin Fathers. So in the first episode of this series, we focused on all of the Church Fathers prior to Nicea, looking at both East and West, and we concluded that the unanimity of evidence essentially confirms the modern Catholic doctrine that marriage is indissoluble and that remarriage is prohibited after divorce. So today we're focusing on the Western Fathers. In a future installment, we will look at the Eastern Fathers as well. So, let's see. So in Nicea, which was in 325, so we are nearing actually an anniversary of the Council of Nicea, this is a relatively important period in the Church. And the reason it's important is because in the post-Nicene Church, we saw an evolution from a church in the catacombs to actually becoming, eventually the official imperial religion. And when this occurred, the church was flooded with converts, many of whom would have been living in marital situations that would have been frowned upon by the church. So some of these converts, may have also had other ulterior motives in their conversion, which would further complicate the matter. So because of this, there'd be a lot more opportunities for the Church Fathers in this period to actually comment on what we are debating today. Given the general kind of secular Roman permissibility towards divorce and remarriage, it is clear from the writers of this period that divorce and remarriage, even in the church, was an extremely common problem. And in the face of mass conversion from groups favoring, divorce, the question must be, did the gates of hell prevail against the church? Did the early apostolic doctrine that was clearly upheld in the earliest church fathers prior to the Council of Nicea, was that done away with? Did the church succumb to cultural pressures to abandon, marital indissolubility? And did the church, importantly, succumb to pressure from secular governments pushing for more liberal reforms? So these are kind of the questions that we're going to be answering today. Now, another important point in this video is I'm going to exclude St. Augustine because I think he deserves his own video. And his case is really interesting because he's written on divorce and remarriage the most of all of these early church fathers, which is why I think he deserves special treatment. And also, there's kind of a burgeoning movement within academic circles as well as apologetic circles who are against Catholicism to try to claim that St. Augustine, because it's very clear in his early writings that he was against remarriage after divorce, there's kind of a burgeoning movement to claim that he changed his minds or at least had second doubts or had later doubts when he died. And I think that's pretty preposterous. So we'll get into that in a separate video as to why I disagree with that. But so St. Augustine is very clearly in the marriage is indissoluble camp. And I would also like to quickly touch again on the methodological considerations. So if you haven't watched the first video, I highly recommend that either after this video or even you can just pause now and go back and at least watch the beginning of the previous video on the Church Fathers and divorce and remarriage prior to the Council of Nicea. But there's a lot of important methodological considerations. So probably the most important one that we're going to talk about a lot today is the principle of non-contradiction. So which I call it the Paland principle because Father Paland, kind of explicitly talked about this in his write-up on this subject. But essentially, it's that we should not try to impute a sort of contradiction between church fathers in one place versus another. So by that I mean, let's say in one place he kind of has a fairly unclear passage in which you could actually possibly construe that he would have allowed remarriage after divorce, but it's not really explicit. But in another place, he explicitly condemns it. Well, in that case, you shouldn't read the unclear as the rule, but rather you should read the unclear statement in light of the clear one, especially because these church fathers were very rigorous thinkers and wouldn't just, contradict themselves willy-nilly. So I think that is it for the scope, and I think we should just move straight into the video. So let's first start with just talking about the Council of Nicea itself. And the reason this is important is because, some reformers within the Catholic Church, such as, Cardinal Casper, in their work, they've actually tried to argue that Canon 8 is a reversal and is some evidence that the early church allowed for remarriage. So let's just read this canon really quickly. So it reads as follows, Canon 8. Concerning those who call themselves Cathari, if they come over to the Catholic and Apostolic Church, the Great and Holy Synod decrees that they who are ordained shall continue as they are in the clergy. But it is before all things necessary that they should profess in writing that they will observe and follow the dogmas of the Catholic and Apostolic Church, in particular, that they will communicate with persons who have been twice married, and that those who have been having lapsed in persecution had a period of penance laid upon them, in a time of restoration fixed, so that all things they will follow the dogmas of the Catholic Church. And then it continues on. But the key point of this here is, I underlined it for everyone, is they will communicate with persons who have been twice married. So Cardinal Casper believes that this is proof that there, and this is quoting Casper, quote, that there existed a pastoral tolerance, clemency, and indulgence, end quote, towards the individuals who were divorced and remarried. But in this case, did the words twice married actually refer to the divorced? And in this case, the answer is no, because the canon is not discussing the topic of divorce and remarriage at all. The canon is actually referring specifically, as you can see in the first sentence, the Cathari, who are also known as Novatianists, who refused remarriage for both widows and widowers. So in other words, it's that they were heretics who would reject remarriage even in the case of spousal death. So as Henry Cruzel noted, Nicea, quote, did not require the Novatians to restore communion with remarried divorcees, end quote. So while advocates of divorce and remarriage have tried to use Nicea to make their case, the proper reading of Canon 8 is that it doesn't really talk about divorce and remarriage at all in the sense that we debate it in the modern context, but instead the practice of remarriage among widows and widowers, which currently every church in existence has pastoral provisions for. So this canon cannot really be used, against, either side here. So let's just continue on here now that we've dispelled that myth. And let's just talk about St. Hilary of Poitiers, who died in 367 AD. Now, St. Hilary is one of the first authors that we've discussed in this series, who was noted by the Second Council of Constantinople as being someone that we should follow in every way. And he wrote in divorce and remarriage in a couple places. So one of the places he writes is in his commentary on St. Matthew's. And in this instance, he writes, so let's see. So yeah, he writes as follows. We advise the reader, nevertheless, that however often one looks at the same question of divorce and remarriage, we must carefully pay attention to the power of words of the Lord's response, and that the words the disciples used. Consider the view of the Apostle Paul in this matter, both in his silence in 1 Corinthians 7, as well as his occasional treatment in other places, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 12 through 40. In word and heart, we should be like the eunuchs. The Lord observes that the state is given to one by nature, in another it is a necessity, and for a third it is by volition. It is nature for one who is born that way, it is necessity for one who has become that way, and it is volition by one who is determined to become a eunuch in hope of the kingdom of God, Matthew 19:12. The Lord declared that we ought to resemble the latter state if we are able. So St. Hilary has made various references in this passage which should uncover his views on the subject. So while setting up his answer, he calls readers to, quote, pay attention to the powers of the Lord's response, end quote, clearly telling his readers that they ought to follow the teaching of Scripture on the question of remarriage. And then Hilary says, quote, the Lord observes that this state is given to one by nature, end quote. And he's citing Genesis 2 here, which we all know reads to let no man put asunder. And then he tells us to, quote, consider the views of the Apostle Paul, which is a clear reference to 1 Corinthians 7, in which verse 11 commands remarried individuals to remain single after separation. And he's possibly even referencing Romans 7 as well. Hilary then echoes Jesus' words about eunuchs, being eunuchs for the kingdoms of God, Matthew 19:12, and the virtues of voluntary celibacy further cement the idea that he would not approve of remarriage after divorce. It is clear to me, at least, that this passage defends the indissolubility of marriage, and I'm not the only one who's read it that way. Anglican Oscar Watkins, for example, writes that, quote, there was no reason to suppose that St. Hilary would have admitted remarriage any more than other of the great doctors of the West. George Joyce and Cruzel also share the same position. And not only that, but elsewhere in his writings, he talks about, for example, he talks about Matthew 5. It's in the commentary on St. Matthew. And it does seem to allow separation, which again is the Catholic position. You're allowed to separate but not remarry. So I do think there are ways that you could read that in a way that lead to indissolubility, but I think it's harder to make the case than with the quote I just presented. So I do think that overall St. Hilary of Poitiers clearly holds to the Catholic position on divorce and remarriage. So now we should talk about an interesting case, which is Ambrosiaster. Now, a lot of apologists and scholars on this subject who have a preconceived notion really try to argue that every single church father that they read, they can just read in whatever. They'll say, oh, look, they all support my position, but I'm not going to do that. Because Ambrosiaster very clearly, and I think he very clearly rejects the idea of marital indissolubility, and he seems to accept the idea that in certain cases, certain individuals can remarry. So what is it that he says? He says this: let not the husband put away his wife. We must supply the words, save for cause of fornication. And therefore the apostle does not add, as in the case of the woman, but if he depart, let him remain unmarried. For a man may marry if he has put away the offending wife, since the law does not bind him as it does a woman, for the head of the woman is a man. So Ambrosiaster clearly and explicitly allows for husbands to remarry if he is the innocent party in an adulterous marriage or in a case of apostasy. But it's also very clear that he still prohibits women from remarrying, but he does it for the wrong reason. He says that it's because they are not bound in the same manner as man. So it's really interesting because you'll have individuals try to cite Ambrosiaster to prove that remarriage is permissible or that there's a certain apostolic, a separate apostolic teaching that allows remarriage. But the problem with this is that no Protestant or Orthodox churches today actually uphold a separate standard for men and women on this point. They do not employ divorce and remarriage in a sex-differentiated manner. So even though he doesn't support the Catholic position, he can't really neatly make the case for any other ecclesial communities' interpretation of the scriptural or historical data either. So again, he was clearly not Catholic in his view, but he clearly wasn't supporting any of the views that anyone else holds either. So let's next talk about St. Ambrose. So St. Ambrose actually is an interesting saint to bring up because he very clearly repudiates the view of Ambrosiaster when it comes to sex differentiation and having different standards of sexual morality. So in De Abraham, for example, and I don't have the quote on screen, but he reads as follows. So he says, "Do not be deceived by the laws of man. Every immorality is an adultery, and what is not licit for the wife is neither licit for the husband. The same chastity is due on the husband part as the wife's." So he's very clearly saying, look, I understand that civil society and secular society does have a two-tiered system for male and female sexual roles and not sexual roles, sorry, but sexual immorality. But he says that's not the case in Catholicism or in the Christian religion. He's stating that the two are held to the same standard of sexual morality. So at any time that a husband is engaging in something adulterous, that would also be adulterous for the man. So I think that's one important point to bring up. And he also goes on to discuss remarriage in another point when he's exegeting Luke 16, and I have Luke 16 on screen for anyone who would like that context as well. So he says this as follows: "You put away your wife as though you had a right to do so and were open to no guilt. You think that you're free to do this because human law does not forbid it, but the divine law forbids it. You obey human rulers, but stand in fear of God. Heed the law of God, to whom those who make the laws themselves owe obedience. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." But here, not only is the divine command broken, but God's handiwork is wrecked. Suppose that the wife whom you have put away does not marry. This would irk you as a man, since she would be remaining faithful to you as an adulterer. Suppose she marries. It is you who would be guilty of the crime of her necessity, and what you consider to be a marriage is really adultery. It makes no difference whether you commit that crime openly confessing it, or you do it as an adulterer disguised under the appearance of a husband. But perhaps someone may say, how is it that Moses permitted that a man could give a bill of divorce and dismiss his wife? The one who says this is Jewish, he is not Christian. Moses permitted this, but God did not command it. The law of God was from the beginning. And what is the law of God? A man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and they will be two in one flesh. Therefore, he who puts away his wife cuts his own flesh in two. He divides his own body. So St. Ambrose is clearly strenuously objecting to civil laws which permit divorce and remarriage. And he argues that for the Christian, these secular laws ought to hold no force. Instead, we ought to follow the divine law. As St. Ambrose offers no exception for adultery here clearly as well. So when he writes, quote, "Suppose she marries, it is you who'd be guilty of her crime of necessity. and what you consider marriage is really adultery, it is clear that he's recognizing that some will be forced into remarriage, especially women, due to financial, legal, or social necessity, but that the remarriage that she's entering is a categorically adulterous affair. And given his writing in De Abraham, where he clearly holds the two sexes on the same, level when it comes to sexual morality, it is clear that the divorce probably would not be acceptable when a man would engage in the practice either. So overall, he's very clearly in this passage calling remarriage adulterous, which is the Catholic view, and is saying that the divorce does not eliminate the bond that the first marriage had, which again is the Catholic view, which is why we don't admit remarriage in the Catholic Church. And what's really interesting in this as well is that he's not merely rejecting pagan divorce law. So he's not objecting to divorce and remarriage just on the basis that, it's a pagan concept. He's actually writing against laws introduced by Emperor Constantine himself, which makes his uncompromising defense of marital indissolubility even all the more impressive, as he's rejecting a Christian Caesar's civil law, something which we will see in later episodes the medieval Byzantine Church lacks the fortitude to do. So St. Ambrose very clearly held to the Catholic position and would have held men and women to the same standard of sexual morality, even though some modern exegetes try to claim that there somehow was a sex-differentiated sexual morality when it came to divorce and remarriage. And again, even if that were the case, that wouldn't support their position anyway. So now let's talk about St. Jerome. Now, St. Jerome, who's a doctor of the Catholic Church, is perhaps one of the top, if not the top, scriptural scholar of his era. And Jerome, in his common fiery style, writes about the subject of remarriage multiple times. In the first place is in his eulogy of St. Fabiola, which is, if you want to look up a copy of that, it's letter 77 on New Advent. And he tells a tale of divorce. I don't have the quote on screen. I'll just kind of summarize it here. So, St. Fabiola was a Roman noblewoman who was married to a man who was a grave sinner. And the sins were so horrible that Jerome refuses to name them, so that must be pretty bad. And St. Fabiola availed herself to the civil law, and she got a divorce. And St. Jerome says that's completely justified. He quotes the Gospel's approval of separation in an adulterous marriage. But Fabiola, however, was improperly instructed because she believed she could remarry after divorce. And because that was the Roman custom, and that's what she was used to, so that's what she ended up doing. But Jerome says that he actually, he readily admits this to have been a fault. Now, he does exonerate her on the ground that she did not know the rigor of the gospel. This is a quote from it. So he exonerates her because, quote, she did not know the rigor of the gospel takes away from women all pretext for remarriage so long as their former husbands are alive. So, fortunately for, St. Fabiola, he talks about how she eventually became aware of this, and then her first husband passed away. So she's no longer bound to her first husband because he died. And when she found this out, she discovered her error. She was able to undergo penance and rectify the situation with the church. But I think the key takeaway here is that he very clearly upholds marital indissolubility here and really says that the only reason she was innocent is because she didn't know about it. But he very clearly states that Scripture forbids remarriage, and that she was able to kind of get out of this because her husband died, which breaks the bond of marriage, and she was able to undergo penance for that sin. And given Jerome's connection to the Roman Church, this really, I think, gives us some insight as to the disciplinary practices of the Roman Church as a whole. And it's very clear from this section with St. Fabiola that remarriage was condemned, and that there was a penance process for those who engaged in this sin, and that she was lucky enough that her husband died, which could break the bond. But so let's get into his next letter here, which is letter 55. And I think letter 55 elucidates his position much more clearly, because it's more general. Because obviously in specific cases, like in St. Fabiola's case, it's sometimes hard to extrapolate that to the whole. So what is it that he says? He says this: a husband may be an adulterer or a sodomite. He may be stained with every crime and may have been left by his wife because of his sins. Yet he is still her husband, which, as we noted in the previous section with St. Fabiola, that was the case. He was still her husband until he passed away. And he is still her husband so long as he lives, and she may not marry another. The apostle does not promulgate this decree on his own authority, but on that of Christ who speaks in him. For he has followed the words of Christ in the gospel. Whoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. And then mark what he says, quote, Whoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery, whether she has put away her husband or her husband her, the man who marries her is still an adulterer. Wherefore the apostle, seeing how heavy the yoke of marriage was, thus made said to him, if the case be so with his wife, it is good not to marry. And the Lord replied, he that is able to receive it, let him receive it. And immediately by the instance of 3 eunuchs, he showed the blessedness of virginity, which is bound by no carnal tie. And I think quite a bit can be drawn from this passage. So first, he's holding that the marriage bond is indissoluble no matter how sinful the spouse is. As he writes, quote, he may be stained with every crime and may have been left by his wife because of his sins, yet he is still her husband. That comports with the Catholic understanding. Second, because of this indissoluble bond, no one can marry a second time. Quote, as long as he lives, she may not marry another, end quote. And third, he states that this rule would apply to husbands, as he quotes the apostles, who are all men, saying that because of this teaching, if this be the case, the man be with his wife, it is good not to marry. And, finally, he's exegeting Matthew 19, which is the common verse that people try to use to claim Scripture teaches remarriage, but he's exegeting it as being against remarriage. So clearly, the interpretation of St. Jerome is not one which would allow divorce and remarriage in Scripture or in the Church. And then how would a woman be re-admitted to communion in this situation? And he talks about it in the next paragraph. So he says, therefore, if your sister who, as she says, has been forced into a second union, wishes to receive the body of Christ and not be counted as an adulteress, let her do penance. So far, at least it is from the time she begins to repent, have no further intercourse with that second husband who ought to be called not a husband but an adulterer. So in other words, the woman has to do penance, probably go to confession, do whatever the priest says, and cease having sexual relations with the second husband. And he even says you can't call that man a husband because he's an adulterer, because she's still clearly bound to her first marriage. And this is the teaching of the Catholic Church. It's a steep teaching, it's a difficult teaching, but the fact is that's the teaching of the Church. If you are a Catholic who is divorced, you are free to do so if there's an extreme reason. But you are not free to remarry. And if you do find yourself in that situation, you cannot have sexual relations, because anytime you engage in those sexual relations, that will be adultery against your first and original spouse, who is still, in some sense, your spouse. So overall, it is very clear that St. Jerome held to the Catholic view of marriage. Now, this next bit is from his, commentary on Matthew. And it's pretty important because, again, he's interpreting the acceptive clause in Matthew 19. I'm not going to go through and read this. So assuming you aren't just doing audio only, you can pause your screen and look at it. Or if you are doing audio only, you can come back to the video later. But what's interesting about this passage is the Orthodox blogger Allura, he doesn't believe that this section supports indissolubility, even though in my opinion it clearly does. And he instead says, quote, that Jerome is just concerned with the prospect of a husband or wife divorcing their spouse for unjustified reasons or on spurious grounds, end quote. But in my opinion, that argument utterly fails if one is reading the preceding context in the source provided, because Jerome makes a multitude references to divine law, marriage turning two into one spirit, and man being powerless to break apart the marriage bond. So Jerome wasn't focusing on the narrow topic of divorce. And his exegesis of Matthew 19 really clearly emphasizes the indestructibility of the marriage bond itself, which is, again, the Catholic position. However, the blogger also admits that, quote, I realize that Jerome's position in his 77th letter is different. Now, the 77th letter is the one we just read. So he's openly admitting that Epistle 77 teaches the Catholic view of marital indissolubility, but he's engaging in a space of special pleading to argue that this other commentary does not somehow teach that. So again, we need to reiterate the Pelland principle of interpretation, that we should not conclude that an author is contradicting what he maintains elsewhere. So we shouldn't try to impute a contradiction to thinking of such a rigorous scholar such as Jerome. So it's very clear that Jerome upheld the indissolubility of marriage. And I should note that there's various other people who agree that St. Jerome held a rigorous view on this topic. Ubi Petrus, for example, notes that they don't disagree that his views do indeed ban remarriage, though they try to argue that Jerome can't be used to support the Catholic position because he only, quote, begrudgingly approves of remarriage after the death of a spouse, unquote. But the begrudging, and that's the key word, the word begrudging is doing the legwork for his argument here. But a begrudging acceptance of remarriage after the death of your spouse isn't foreign to the Catholic position either. In fact, the Ukrainian Eastern Catholic Catechism, Christ Our Pascha, actually has that same position. So this modern catechism says, quote, the church encourages the widower or widow to preserve fidelity to the deceased partner as an indication of their unique relationship, end quote. So that's essentially the same position as Jerome. He thinks it's also ideal that if you are a widow or widower, that it is better that you remain unmarried. But the church allows you to do so. Really, to claim that Jerome doesn't uphold the Catholic position on this topic is kind of a stretch. It is very clear that St. Jerome should be categorized as having the Catholic position on the topic of divorce and remarriage. So overall, I think it's very clear to say that Jerome holds the Catholic position. So let's go to Pope St. Innocent. So if I were talking about Augustine, I would be talking about him right now. But I'm going to separate Augustine into his own video. So Pope St. Innocent is one of the many great popes of the 5th century, and he writes beautifully about the indissolubility of marriage in a couple locations. And the first is in his letter to Victorius. So he says this, for if this rationale is upheld in all cases, that whichever woman weds another man while her husband yet lives is considered an adulteress, and license for her to do penance is not granted unless one of them has died, how much more ought it be to maintain for her who had first joined herself to an immortal spouse, and afterward transgressed to human marriage? So with his letter to Victorius, it's very clear in this epistle that we see that Pope Innocent is invoking the principle of a woman who remarries. So he's saying that if a woman remarries while her husband still lives, she's committing adultery, and that the marriage bond is only dissolved by death. Once again, that's the Catholic position. In the letter to Experius, he says as follows. Let's see. Yes. Concerning those also your affection has inquired about, who have joined themselves to another marriage intervening divorce, it is manifest that they are adulterers on both sides. Moreover, those who, while their wife still lives, though the marriage bond may seem severed, have hastened to another union, they cannot be seen as adulterers to such an extent that even the persons to whom they were joined also seem to have committed adultery themselves. According to that which we read in the Gospel, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And therefore, all such ones who must be held back from the communion of the faithful. Concerning their parents, however, or close relatives, nothing of the kind can be decreed, unless they are detected to have been instigators of the unlawful union. And what's interesting about this quote as well, this is kind of a random tidbit, is that Rabbus Maurus, in his 9th century collection of Canon, cites this passage in support of marital indissolubility, which I'll eventually get to in a future video when I discuss, the Carolingian era. So what are the key things we can draw out of this quote? So the first is that those who remarry after divorce are guilty of adultery on both male and female sides of the union. The second thing we can draw out is that even if a previous marriage was severed or disrupted, remarrying while one's prior spouse lives still constitutes adultery. So once again, no remarriage as long as your other spouse is alive. And that this teaching is based on the gospel, and that divorcing and remarrying is adultery, and that adulterous remarried couples must be excommunicated and not receive communion. So it's very clearly this passage reflects the strong prohibition in Catholic teaching against divorce and remarriage, and is rooted in, Jesus' words in the gospel. So the next quote I would like to get into with Pope Innocent here is in his letter to Probus, because sometimes this is brought up, kind of against the Catholic position on remarriage. And I'm just going to skip to the last sentence here, because it's kind of this last sentence that people point to when they're trying to argue that Pope St. Innocent would have allowed remarriage. And he said this, wherefore, O rightfully illustrious son, we decree, with the Catholic faith giving support, that to be the marriage which was first established by divine grace, and the compact with the second woman, the first still living, and not cast off by divorce, can by no means be illegal. So in the overall passage, the Pope is decreeing by his authority that the first marriage to Ursa was the legitimate one established by God's grace, and therefore the subsequent reunion that the individual has engaged in was illegitimate. But when it comes to the last quote, there's some kind of important context that people are missing when they try to claim this sentence supports remarriage. So Innocent had been appealed to not merely as Pope, but also due to his legal competence. So Oscar Watkins, and I put this on the bottom of the screen here, and I just put 2 numbers here to make it a little simple. I didn't change the quote at all. I just added the 2 numbers. It says that it can be more clearly read as follows. So essentially, illustrious son, we decree 1, with the Catholic faith, giving support that the marriage was first established by divine grace. Okay, so that's the first part. And then the second part is, and we compact with the second woman, the first still living and not cast off by divorce can by no means be legal. So as can be seen, he's giving his first legal and his ecclesiastical ruling. In this case, they both happen to agree. So the Catholic faith in the first part maintains that the first marriage is correct. And then he's also saying, but also on the legal side, no divorce has been procured. So he's saying that regardless of which appeal, so whether you're appealing to him legally or you're appealing to him as Pope, both of them uphold that you need to return to the first wife, Ursa. He's not saying that if you casted her off by divorce, that you'd be allowed to remarry. And I should note that I'm not the only one that has come to this conclusion. Another Anglican, not just Oscar Watkins, but Hollyworth Kingdon agrees that this section would not be support for remarriage. So overall, it's very clear that Pope Innocent upheld to the indissolubility of marriage, and believed that the sacramental marriage bond could not be broken by divorce, or even by other circumstances such as abduction, separation, or captivity in the case of the barbarian invasions. So Pope Innocent clearly upheld to the Catholic position. And next we get to Pope Leo the Great. Oh, did I go forward? Okay. So Pope Leo was one of the most important men to occupy the apostolic throne in Rome. And here on screen, I just have a little bit of the Byzantine liturgy, which shows how highly regarded he is not only in the West, but also in the East, as being a champion of orthodoxy and teacher of holiness. And he outlines why marriage is indissoluble in letter 167. So in letter 167, he says as follows: "Not every woman that is joined to a man in his wife, even as every son is not in his father," let me redo that. "Not every woman that is joined to a man is his wife, even as every son is not his father's heir. But the marriage bond is legitimate between the freeborn and between equals. This was laid down by the Lord long before the Roman law had its beginning. And so a wife is different from a concubine, even as a bondswoman from a free woman. For which reason also the apostle, in order to show the difference of these persons, quotes from Genesis, where it is said to Abraham, 'Cast out the bondswoman and her son, for the son of the bondswoman shall not be heir with my son Isaac.' And hence, since the marriage tie was from the beginning so constituted as apart from the joining of the sexes to symbolize the mystic union of Christ and his church, it is undoubted that the woman has no part in matrimony. In those cases, it is shown that the mystery of marriage has not taken place." So then we can also continue here. Let's see. So yes, "But because we know it is written that a woman is joined to a man by God, and again we are aware of the precept that what God has joined, man may not put asunder," Matthew 19, "we are bound to hold that this compact of the lawful marriage must be renewed, and after the removal of the evils inflicted by the enemy, what each lawfully has much been restored to him, we must take every pains that each should recover his own." And, he continues on. You can keep reading the quote here. But it's very clear that, in this passage, that if the woman freely returns to their first husbands, there's no problem that arises. But for women who wish to stay with their second husband, they're going to get excommunicated. So he's clearly stating that, remarriage is not admissible. In the first quote, he's talking about, the difference between a marriage and a concubinage, being a concubine or a wife. And he states that the difference is that the marriage tie, symbolizes Jesus' marriage to the church. And, as you all know, in the same way it would be insane to imagine Jesus divorcing his church and marrying another. If that is the case, then there should be no reason why the Lord would allow us, who are engaging in the same type of union with a spouse, to divorce and then remarry another. So it is very clear in my reading of these writings that Pope St. Leo the Great held to the Catholic position on the indissolubility of marriage, and that women who stay with second husbands and remarry after divorce are to be excommunicated. So he clearly would have held to the Catholic position. So Let's also talk about the Synod of Carthage. And the Synod of Carthage is important because it plays a big role in the later debates in the West on divorce and remarriage, and this canon is quoted quite a bit in later ecclesiastical sources as well as in canon law, and it reads as follows. We decree that, according to the evangelical and apostolical doctrine, it is lawful neither for a man divorced by his wife, nor a wife divorced by her husband to marry another, but that such a one must remain single. Or they must be reconciled to one another, in that if they set this law at naught, they must do penance, and further that the emperor be besought to issue a law into this effect. So, from this quote, it's very clear that the Synod is teaching the indissolubility of marriage and prohibits remarriage after divorce. The only objection which could be levied against this is that the canon says punishment for remarriage was only that they must do penance. But as we've seen throughout the rest of the Latin Fathers, the penance involves ceasing sexual relations with their new spouse. Otherwise, you'd get excommunicated. So it's kind of absurd to imagine a scenario where one was issued a penance, but then would be permitted to continue living openly in that same exact sin for which they were given penance. So it's very clear that the Synod of Carthage held to the Catholic position on this subject. So next, we're going to talk about the Synod of Angers in 453 AD. Hopefully I didn't butcher the pronunciation of that. And this is Canon 6, so it says, those who under the name of marriage live in adultery with other men's wives while their husbands are still living are to be held excommunicate. So the canon is clearly teaching that wives are still bound to their husbands after divorce, and that men who attempt to marry them are committing adultery. And Kingdon believes that that Kingdon's an Anglican scholar here, we're quoting at the bottom. He's saying that this does refer to a marriage after divorce. Cardinal Bevilacqua, another scholar, also says that the canon stood in direct contrast with Frankish law at the time, which would have permitted these remarriages, and clearly states that the church is not of the same mind as the secular government in allowing remarriage. And Oscar Watkins, another Anglican, also concludes that the canon on remarriage after divorce is an untroubled utterance of early Christian conviction against remarriage. So Angers, just like the Synod of Carthage, also clearly holds to the Catholic position. So we now have two particular synods upholding marital indissolubility. So now let's talk about the Council of Vannes, or the Synod of Vannes, in 465 AD. So Canon 2 reads as follows. Those who have abandoned their wives, except for the cause of fornication, as the Gospel says, without proof of adultery, and have married others, we decree are to be excommunicated, lest the sins overlooked through our indulgence entice others to the license of error. So Anglican Kingdon does believe that this canon seems to connive at remarriage after divorce following proof of adultery. So does the modern scholar Philip Reynolds, who also, likewise argues that one must accept that a man who could prove that his wife was guilty of adultery would not have been excommunicated if he marries another woman. But I don't buy this interpretation. So why don't I buy this interpretation? So the reason I don't is because the Frankish kingdoms at this time, as we noted previously with the previous synod in Angers in 453, the Frankish kingdoms had excessively liberal divorce and remarriage laws. And all of the bishops present, according to Oscar Watkins, with the exception of St. Padron, would have been Franks. And while the Frankish kingdoms had liberal divorce laws, it is not clear from the canon that the Frankish church did. As scholar George Joyce notes, we don't have solid documentary evidence until the 8th century that the Frankish church attempted to tolerate divorce and remarriage. As we show in later chapters as well, the introduction of divorce and remarriage into Frankish ecclesial practice was driven by the circulation of various penitential works, which held to a more liberal view on the subject. And we'll get into that later in a separate video. And to further support Joyce's contention that there isn't strong evidence that the Frankish church at this time would have allowed for remarriage, is that the initial synodal response to these penitential works in the Frankish kingdoms at the councils of Nantes and Soissons, they both upheld marital indissolubility. So it seems unlikely to me that the first official Frankish responses to the penitential books in the 8th century would have upheld indissolubility if their direct predecessors in this council and the next one we're about to discuss had already codified remarriage into Frankish ecclesial regulations. So overall, it's very difficult to read this as being in favor of remarriage because the councils directly subsequent to it, just a couple centuries later, they clearly uphold marital indissolubility. So if this council had already instituted, marital dissolubility, that is an allowance for remarriage, it'd be very odd for these future councils to just, ban it without reference to this. And what I think is also noteworthy, especially from this synod, given the historical context, is not the inclusion of the acceptive clause in Matthew 19, but the strong general condemnation of divorce or remarriage within a cultural context where divorce or remarriage is the norm. So overall, I don't think that this council is strong evidence in favor of remarriage. It also should be noted that Heffley, in his kind of compilation of History of Church Councils, notes that this council was largely merely reiterating past ordinances. And as we noted, the previous ordinance at the Synod of Angers was in favor of marital indissolubility. Another scholar, most scholars, but Cardinal Bevilacqua says that the wording of the canon is awkward and leaves it open to several interpretations. And I generally agree with that assessment. So I personally would categorize the canon as being unclear on the teaching of divorce and remarriage, but you guys can form your own opinion based on the kind of historical context yourself and come to whatever reading you would like. So then we have the Synod of Agde in 506, Canon 25, is kind of a similar take on divorce and remarriage. I'm not going to read the canon, but it's on screen for those of you who want to read it. Modern scholars like Hunter, as well as Anglican Oscar Watkins, believe that it does leave room for remarriage, whereas others like Bevilacqua and Kingdon say that there's no evidence of remarriage in the canon. I think that the pro-remarriage argument from this canon is largely one from silence and is therefore not very convincing. So, for example, it says the passage states that those who dismiss their conjugal fellowship because of grave fault do not provide satisfactory grounds to be excluded from communion. So, the implication here is that maybe there are some, dismissals through grave fault that would allow remarriage, but the canon actually doesn't mention, remarriage after separation. So, as George Joyce argues, the purpose of the canon was to enforce the church's rule that no person married may break off from his partner unless he has pleaded his case before an episcopal court first and has obtained a decision that allows for a justified separation. And again, as he notes, quote, "There is not a word in the canon which offers any solid ground for thinking it would have allowed remarriage," end quote. And on that reading, the canon's concern would be the justification for divorce in the ecclesial processes related to divorce rather than the ecclesial processes opening the door for remarriage. So in my opinion, Oscar Watkins and, David Hunter, who's kind of a modern scholar who supports kind of liberal views on this topic, they're basically relying on silence to do the talking for them. So these authors, in my opinion, are merely engaging in the same word concept fallacy that Henry Cruzel and others have pointed out decades ago, that, they'll read procedures related to divorce, separation, rupture, dissolution, whatever, and then apply it to remarriage. But that's not necessarily the case and doesn't necessarily follow. So overall, given the clear historical context of the permissive Frankish divorce laws that the council was up against, I would say that it's also, again, interesting that the law is very clearly taking a strict line on the case of divorce. And in my opinion, even a strict literal reading of the canon just merely falls short of endorsing remarriage. It's entirely an argument from silence. So overall, again, I don't think that this synod can be easily categorized as having one opinion or the other. I don't believe it contradicts the Catholic position. And once again, given the later Frankish response to divorce and remarriage a couple centuries later, which is very clearly rapidly against remarriage, I think it's unlikely that that would be the case had the synod encoded and codified remarriage in the Frankish church ecclesial system. So I personally would categorize it as unclear, leaning towards probably even against. You can make an argument from silence in the opposite direction as well. But again, I'll leave that for you viewers to decide. So in conclusion, 8 or 72% of the authors that we've reviewed, and I'm counting Augustine in these 8, I'll prove that in a separate video, of the authors we reviewed held to the absolute indissolubility of marriage. And only one author held to a contrary view, that is, allowing for remarriage. And every single canonized saint we have discussed in this section held to marital indissolubility. And Henry Cruzel summarizes the evidence from this period as follows. Among the Latin authors before the year 400, there's only, therefore, one who, during the first 5 centuries, permitted remarriage in both cases provided for, namely that of Matthew 19. In other words, there's only one dissenter, which is Ambrosiaster, as we noted.
So again, here's a tabular summary. You see the 8 authors holding the clearly Catholic position. You see the 2 authors, the 2 synods, which I argue were unclear. And then there's 2 synods, which I think were clearly in the Catholic position. And then 1 dissenter, 1 single author. So overall, the evidence from this period continues to demonstrate that the early testimony of the Latins, like the testimony of the pre-Nicene Church discussed in the first video, demonstrates the antiquity and strength of the Catholic position over alternative theories of divorce and remarriage, and in my opinion shows that the Catholic position on the subject is the only valid development we can draw, and the only church, in my opinion, that I think upholds a position that would be recognizable to our Lord, and the only church that upholds his principles on marriage. So with that said, I would like to thank you all for watching. Comment if you agree, or comment if you disagree as well. And yeah, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the future.